Hi there, Philip here. This is the second part of the JavaScript beginners tutorial where we build a to-do list app you should not build. There are two things that I've added to the app which should not be there. First, as you can see, to complete a task, you need to push the grandma off the cliff. And the other thing is, once you've added a task, the app completely changes it to whatever it thinks you should be doing instead. If you haven't watched the first part of the tutorial, watch it first. In this video, we'll complete building the main functionality of the app, learn a couple of more essential coding concepts, host our web app for free, and turn our web app into a mobile app, sort of, in just one tap. So let's begin. One thing I forgot to mention in the last video was that to preview your website, you just drag your HTML file into a browser. First of all, let's add the remove tasks functionality, like I promised in the last tutorial. This is actually very simple. To do that, we just need to first add the event listener, and we do it like so. And then we pass the event listener. First of all, we pass it a parameter click, which will listen for clicks in the window. And the second parameter we pass it is the function that we want to perform on that click happening. Now, obviously, this function does not exist yet, so we need to create it now. Function on remove task click. Event, it's the parameter which will hold all the information about our event here. And basically, the way you remove an element from the page with JavaScript is very simple, because an element object has the method called remove. And when you call this method on an element, it removes it. But what do we call it on? That's the question. This needs to be the whole element, right? This parent element remove. The word this is a special keyword that refers to an object that called the event, where the event happened. And then parent element is basically a parent element of this object, which in our case is a element, which we need to remove. So now if we run it, everything disappears because we're not saving any tasks, but we will do it later. Let's walk the dog this time and still wash a cat. Not any specific one, just any cat. And now if we click that, you would see that now we are removing tasks successfully. This is not the best way, however, to remove things, because parent element can change if you change the DOM structure, and then you would need to rewrite it. And that's actually what would happen later in the video. And I will show you how to do that in a better way. So let's move on. So now there was this bug that I mentioned in the previous video that we've left in our code. It's to do with the unique ID of tasks. At the moment, if you look at the code, you would not see any checkboxes because I've removed them, because we would not need them actually at all. But for the purpose of the demonstration, let me bring them back. So the problem with setting the unique ID like this is this. We're setting the unique ID based on the number of tasks. So let me show you why this is bad. We add the first task, and this is task with the ID task 1. We add the second task, and this is a task with the ID task 2. We add the third task, and this is a task with the ID task 3. A lot of Bashar Assads here, but we will just ignore this for the moment. Task 2, task 1, and task 0, because everything starts actually with 0, not with 1. So now we can remove one task. What we are left with at the moment is task with the ID task 2 and the task with the ID task 1. So now when we add another task, it would have the ID task 2, because it calculates the number of tasks on the screen. But the problem is, this task has also the ID task 2, because it hasn't changed. So now when we try to check the checkbox by clicking on a label, it would check the wrong checkbox. So how do we fix that? It's actually very easy. We're going to need this variable in the future, so let's leave it like that. But let's create a new one instead and name this variable unique ID. So in JavaScript there is an object called date, and this object has the method called now. If we log this, you see that every time this number is different. And this number is basically just a number of milliseconds that passed since 1st of January 1917 And this number is basically just a number of milliseconds that have passed since the 1st of January 1970 at 12 AM, which is called the Unix epoch date. So obviously, every time we add a new task, this number of seconds is different because more seconds pass. So now we can use this unique ID to create the new task ID. The checkbox ID would be set to task ID, and the label for would also be set to this task ID. And now if we look at what it renders, we would see that these task IDs are now different, and each has its own unique number. And now let's have some fun and make our to-do list app have a mind of its own. First, we will need a function that generates a random number. Let's call it generate random int, and the parameter it will take is max limit, named after a famous NASCAR driver. So I've created a function that generates a random integer, which is basically a whole number. And then what this function does is returns this number. Functions can return things. So for example, if we now run this function in the console and then call it here and give it some number, it will generate the random number within the number given. But actually things like these you can just Google, copy and paste. Now we need to give our app a vocabulary so it can rewrite our tasks to whatever it wants. And the way we do it by having two more variables, which we would have as separate files and linked to in the index.html. One of the files would be called verbs.js and the other file would be called nouns.js. Inside them we would have variables containing different words. I've put them in separate files because they're so big. And when you load it like this, just before your main.js file, variables that go inside these files would also be available in our main.js. So if you look inside this file, we would see this. It would basically be a variable called nouns, which would contain a collection of nouns. A variable that is a collection of things like this is called an array. It always has two square braces like this and stuff that goes inside it separated by commas. In our case, it's a collection of strings. It doesn't have to be strings, it can be anything, it could be numbers or other things. And if we try to access this variable, let's try to do it in the console, we would see that it gives us this whole collection. However, you can also access each of them separately. And the way you do it is you type the name of the array, followed by two square braces, and then the index number of the element you're trying to access. So for example, a car is under number 2 here, and if we do it like this, we'll get the car. And in coding, all numbers always start with 0, not with 1. That's what you should remember. So this is exactly how our app would be able to access these words separately. And now verbs is the same, just has a number of verbs in there. And the way I've generated them is I asked ChatGPT, which is an AI language model, to generate me an array of verbs. So now let's write a function that would use these two arrays to mess up our tasks whenever we type them. And let's call it mess up text. It will accept two parameters, text and severity. First of all, it will generate two random numbers to select random words from either of the arrays. Random. So const random number 1 and const random number 2. Random number 1 will equal to some random number. And the limit will be the length of the nouns array, because this random number cannot be bigger than the number of items inside nouns. And similarly here, we will generate a random number, but now it will equal to the number of verbs. So now what we need to do is to pick a random noun and a random verb. So like we've seen in the example here, you can access every item in the array when you type the index of this item inside the square braces, which is exactly what these random numbers would do. And now let's create a variable called messed up text. And what this variable will be equal to is very simple. It will be just a random verb followed by the article, which is followed by the random noun. So now we can use this function. So at the moment, quite naturally, our task text equals to the value of the task text input. So let's change that. So it will now equal to the value this function returns, and we pass it the text of the text field. So now whenever we type something normal in there, it would completely fuck it up. It's actually that, to be honest, we don't even need to type anything in there. You can just press enter Oh, I should do that one. Completely forgot. So actually, we don't even need these two parameters. It's only if you want to make this function a bit more complex and say mess up the text based on the level of severity. For example, you want to leave parts of the text that the user would be typing. For example, you could have a conditional statement here like this, which would set the messed up text variable to different things, based on what was passed to the function as a severity parameter. For example, if the severity is high, the text will be completely replaced, like we have it right now. If the severity is medium, the original text will be kept, but also then some new text will be added to the original text. And if the severity is Santa, the text will always be ho ho ho. And if no parameter was passed to a function, then it will default to messing up the whole text. So now if we pass the second parameter to this function, it will behave in a way that is specified in the condition. And if we change this parameter to something else, So one last thing left to do before we can switch to programming the UI and the UX of this thing is to be able to save the tasks, because now if you reload the page, it would all go away. And it's actually very easy to save them. Let's write another function, save tasks. Actually, let's write it like this, so that any developers who are also poachers who will be watching this video would remember about the bad thing they are doing. First of all, let's get all the tasks that we would need to save. We're using the method called getElementsByTagName here, which basically gets all the elements that we specify and returns it in the form of an array. So we can access each element the way we access an element in an array, by a number. Now let's create an empty variable and name it allTaskTexts. It would equal to an empty array at the moment. My plan is to separate task texts from its elements, because getElementsByTagName returns the whole element, and I only need to save the texts of these elements. So now what we need to do is to go through all these elements that are being returned and put each text of these elements inside allTaskTexts array. And the way we do it is with a loop. Loops are used in programming to loop through things. And the structure of a loop always looks like this. It kind of looks like an if statement, but inside the brackets things are a little bit different. Inside these brackets there are always these three parts that are separated by a semicolon. The first part is declaring a variable, which is always an integer. The second part is a condition, and while this condition is true, the loop will continue looping. And in the third part, on every loop iteration, what would happen is this index number would be increased by 1, which is done by these two plus signs here. So basically, we've defined a variable called index, set it to 0, and then we say while index is less than allTasks length, which is basically the number of tasks that we have on the page, we will increase this index number by 1, run our code inside the loop, and then run the loop again. And while this condition is true, this loop will keep looping like this, increasing the index by 1 on every iteration. And now we need to put each text of each task inside this array. When you want to put stuff in the array, there is a method that is called push. And as a parameter to this method, you pass the thing that you want to push to the array. In this case, this is the inner text of each label inside each list element. This would always contain a different number. Then query selector, label. And then we get the inner text of this label. So basically what the loop does is it loops through all of these list elements, goes inside them, and gets the text of each of the label inside of these list elements. And then it puts them into a separate array called allTaskTexts. And now what I need to do is to save this array, so it's available to us whenever we load the page again. And then we can use this array to re-render all the tasks to the page. And to save things without any servers or server-side coding, we can just use the property of a window object called localStorage. LocalStorage is a property of a window object, and it allows you to save any data to basically your browser window, and makes it accessible even after you close and reopen your browser. And the way you save to the localStorage is with the method called setItem. And this method takes two parameters. A string, which would be kind of like a name of the item you're creating in the local storage, which you would then later use to retrieve it. And as a second parameter, it takes this item that you want to save. And in our case, this is the array called allTaskTexts. So now we can call this function every time we create a new task, and it will save it. And now if we run this, call our local storage here, we would see that it would contain all the tasks that we've just added. However, if we reload the page, they would not be there. That is because we still need to be able to retrieve them from the local storage and display them on the page as tasks again. And the way we do it is quite easy actually. And the way we retrieve stuff from local storage is by a method called getItem, to which we pass a string that we use to create an item in the local storage, which is all the task texts. But the problem is, whenever we use this method, it will return a string, like this. But to be able to display each text in a separate task, we actually need this string to be an array instead, so that we can loop through an array and then display it as a separate task. And the way we turn a string into an array in JavaScript is by using the split method. The split method basically takes the string and splits it into items in the array, but it needs to know where to split, so it needs to accept the divider as a parameter. In our case, this is very simple, it's just a comma, because when we look at this string, each of our text is separated by a comma. So we use this comma to break it up into separate elements in the array. So basically now saved tasks is an array of our task texts. And the only thing that is left to do to display them is to just loop through this array and put each of its items in a separate list element. And then to add tasks, we just use our usual addTask function. And we just pass it the contents of each of the items of the array. And now we just need to call it and make it run. And the place we do it is on the very top of the document, because that's the first thing our app needs to do, is to display the tasks. So now if we reload it, we would see all of our tasks that we've added. The only thing that's left to do with this is to also save tasks whenever they are removed, because now if we remove one and then reload the page, it will come back. So basically all we do is call the function save tasks also whenever we delete each task, which is here. And now if we delete it and reload, it wouldn't come back. So now we can do the UI and the UX part of this thing. First of all, you might have noticed that I've already added some CSS here that wasn't here before. I'm resetting all the CSS on the page, that's always a good thing to do, and I've also added some Google fonts. I have also completely removed the checkbox, because we're not gonna need it, as we're gonna kick the grandma off the cliff instead. And I've also disabled all the click events on the label of the checkbox, because we're actually not gonna need it too, but more on that later. Also, this is a complete CSS file that I've got here, and I won't be typing things in it as we go. I will just explain what I've done here, because the main focus of this tutorial is JavaScript. And also these visuals will require us to change the markup a little bit. First of all, there'll be a div that will be wrapping each of the task elements. Let's call it task item wrapper. This div will have a class. We'll use this class in the CSS to style it. So now every element that we'll have in our task item will go inside this wrapper. This will be kind of like a top level div for us. So every element that before went into the task item will now go into this task wrapper, and the task wrapper will be inside the task item. Now we have a li element, and inside it is a task wrapper item. And you can see the style has already kicked in, because I have the CSS with all the styles in it already. Now at the moment the text of the task is directly inside the label. It needs to be also in a separate wrapper. I will explain why later. So let's comment this out, and let's put this text in a separate wrapper. We will also add a class to it, and now label text will have inner text that is equal to the text of our task. Now you can see that we've put it in a separate div now, and it is hidden, and this is intentional. The first item in our task wrapper actually should be the cliff body, which is basically an element that will represent the body of the cliff, which the grandma will be thrown from. Now we need to vary the brightness of each cliff so they separate from each other visually. So what we do here is create a separate variable called cliff brightness, and then this variable is used to set the background color of the cliff body, which is in the HSL color space, which is hue, saturation, lightness, and we're just changing the lightness parameter. And because the number of tasks is different on every task creation, this variable will also be different, therefore creating a different brightness of the color. And the way we can use variables inside a JavaScript strings, which this is a string, is by using these special characters. They are called literals, template literals, or a grave accent character. So you can write any text string, and then when you need to insert a variable inside this string, you just add this variable wrapped inside curly braces that are preceded by the $sign. And then I've also forgot to add the percentage sign in here. So now when we reload this, we would see that these have variable brightness now. Now we need to add this sharp cliff edge and actually make it different every time the new task is created. So let's do that. So now we've created a new div, set its class to cliff edge, and then added it to cliff body. So now we can see that inside our task item wrapper there is a cliff body, and then inside of these there is a cliff edge, which is basically also an absolute position div, but with a 0 height and width, and 3 of its borders set to transparent. That is how we're creating triangles in the CSS. But now we need to make the angles of these cliff edges vary, so it's a bit more fun for our grandma to fall from. And this variable will also be equal to a random integer. But now we need the number in a certain range of numbers, let's say from 10 to 70. So this edge is varying only between 10 to 70 pixels. We do not have this function yet, however, but this is something you can also steal from the internet. You do not have to write it, which is exactly what I did, because I'm super great at math. And you can steal it from me. All the code will be in the description of this video. So anyway, this function will generate a random number within a range that we've given it. And now we can use it to set the cliff edge width. Here we're setting the property border right width to this random number that we're generating. And again, this is just a JavaScript string with a variable inside it. This looks a little weird, and this is because there is one thing left to do with this. Our cliff body also needs to account for this variable width of these elements now and adjust accordingly. Right now it always has this right offset of -30 pixels. This needs to change. Cliff body style right minus edge variable pixels, and edge variable needs to go above it, otherwise it doesn't know it exists. And every time we reload the page, these cliffs will be different. And to the grandma now. Grandma will also have its own container, and that would help contain the grandma. It will also be just div, and then grandma inner container goes inside the grandma container. And finally, there'll be a grandma image, which will also just be div with a background image in it. And the grandma image goes inside the grandma inner container. The grandma is here. But as you can see, we can't just yet push it off. And there is one other thing we need to do. It'd actually be kind of useful to display the text of the tasks. And we've hidden it on purpose. We're now actually going to create a duplicate of this text and put it in an absolute position div. And the reason we need this is because we need to be able to drag the text and to make it push the grandma off the cliff. Because at the moment, if we start dragging the text, which we already have inside this li element, it would drag the whole cliff with it as well, because it's not an absolute positioned text. But the thing is, it also needs to stay there because it sets the width of the cliff. Therefore, we need to have two texts. The one that's invisible one, that sets the width of this cliff, and the other one that is actually shown to a user, that will be used to push the grandma off the cliff. So let's add this final text element before we can start dragging stuff. Mistake there. Yes. And how do you make an element draggable in JavaScript? Well, actually, you just Google make an element draggable, and then you copy and paste the code. The thing is, though, I had to modify it a little bit to make it work on mobile. Most of the time it's to do with repurposing stuff that others have already written. Because why would you need to spend your time writing what's already written, right? So I've also copied this code and modified it slightly, because originally this code only worked on desktop, so I made it work on mobile as well. And also I added two parameters to it, onDragProgress and onDragEnd, to which we can pass functions that would happen on dragProgress and on dragEnd, which would allow us to drop the grandma off the cliff. And as you can see here, that what this whole function that we've copied does is basically just sets the CSS left attribute of the element that is being dragged to a position of a cursor. So now all we need to do is just call this function. And we call this function during the task creation, because we need to pass this the element that we want to drag, which is each of the tasks. Here's our big function that creates the task. And now here we can just call this function. So for now, let's just call it without these two other parameters, and the draggable element will be the grandma inner container, which contains the text and the image of a grandma. Now we can drag the grandma, but you can see it doesn't want to fall. And also we need to make this text return to its original position, or rather the position that is kind of slightly shifted, so we want it to be somewhere here. So basically what we want to do is whenever this drag event is happening, we need to check if the grandma has crossed a certain threshold and then drop it. And that's why we need this parameter onDragProgress inside this drag element function. So now let's write a function that we will pass as this parameter. On grandma being dragged. This function does not exist yet, so now let's create it. And this function will have a single parameter, grandma. And now inside this function we need to detect if the grandma has passed a certain threshold. Basically, offset left is the property of an HTML element, which is equal to how far the element is from the left side of the window. And if we look at our grandma inner container, that's the element that we'll be dragging, and that's the element we will be detecting the offset left of. You would see that this element sits right on the edge of the window, so its offset left is 0. And what we can see from here, it's always around 70 pixels to the edge of the cliff. So basically, whenever this offset left is equal to 70, we need to drop the grandma query selector, grandma image, style top equals 1500 pixels. We just set the top attribute of the grandma image to 1500 pixels. And if you look in the CSS at the grandma image style, you would see that it has a transition property of all set to 2 seconds, which means this fall would be animated. And there she goes. And there she goes again. And adios, grandma. Now what I want to do is to return these texts to their positions, and that is why we need the onDragEnd parameter here. So let's write a function for that. On grandma released, this parameter will be equal to the container that is being dragged, and all we do is this. We just add a new class to it called animateReturn, and if you look at it, it basically just sets the transition to all and 5 seconds. And then we just set the CSS left to 60 pixels. So now it returns. And it doesn't return exactly to the place it was taken from. The idea was to indent these tasks as well. So apart from missing the grandma, you would be able to see the indent and see that these tasks have been completed already. And now just one last thing, because our HTML structure has changed, we need to change the remove functionality of the task a little bit. Instead of referring to the parent element, because it's now different, like I mentioned initially, it actually needs to find the closest parent Lee element. And the way you do it is this, closest Lee. That way, when you click on the task remove button, it will traverse up the DOM tree and will find the closest Lee element, and then it will delete it. And finally, I've also added some background to the HTML so that there is a sunset. I initially wanted the grandma to fall into the sea of lava, but then I thought the sunset looks nicer. The only thing that's left to do is to put this online. And now, in a brief Vietnamese flashback, another Philip, who is also me, will quickly explain how to host your web app for free and very easily.
And you can do it for free very easily by using GitHub Pages. You might have heard of GitHub before, and this is something you'd be using a lot if you continue your journey as any kind of a developer. First of all, you need to go to GitHub and create an account. It will guide you through the process. After you've created an account, you will see this page. Click on the plus icon in the top right corner and select New Repository. All you need to do here is just name your repository. And then just click Create Repository. That's all we need to do here. And now to host our files, you just click Uploading an existing file. And then you just open your project folder on your computer and drag both of your files here. And then you click Commit Changes here. And the final step that you need to do to see this online is to go to Settings, then to Pages, and then under the branch, you need to click Main and Save. You will see here that it says your GitHub Pages site is currently being built, which means you just need to wait a little bit. And after you've waited, you just reload the page. And now here you can see the button that says Visit Site. That means that your site has been deployed. And if you want to change your files, you just need to go back to the repository and basically just do the same thing over again. Just drag them in here. After which you just click Commit Changes and they're live.
So now what you can do is you can sort of turn it into an app. You just open your app as a website in your browser and then click the share button, scroll down here and say add to home screen. And now this icon that we've added in the HTML pulls up here. So now you can just add it to your home screen. And here it is. You can now easily access it. So you can do that, or there are a lot of other services that allow turning your web page into a mobile app very easily. And the way to get a custom icon for this app is basically to put a PNG with the name icon.png, and then here in the HTML you put these two guys with the link to the icon.png. And this is how iPhone will know that this is the icon of your web page when you add it to your home screen. And this all is just to illustrate the point that in order to code a mobile app, especially as simple as this one, you don't need to know how to code a mobile app. You can just use JavaScript and simple HTML and CSS. So thank you very much for watching, subscribe, hit the bell, it helps all those people who repeatedly confuse the word bell with the word hell, and see you soon.